Welcome back to
Hey.
another episode of the Piano Pedagogy Podcast, the podcast where we talk about topics related to piano pedagogy and music teaching. I'm Jacqueline Beckoff, and I own a successful piano studio in Southern California, and I'm also the owner of Defined Music Teacher. With me, as always, is Arianne Lacra, the owner of
Hi.
Whittier Family Music School in Southern California. How are things going today, Arianne?
Doing well. It's a nice day out. I'm happy to be here and excited for our second podcast, Piano Pedagogy Podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Our two topics today are scales and continuous improvement. Since we started with Arianne's topic last week, let's start with mine today. All right.
Sounds great.
So, continuous improvement. This is something that we typically expect of students, right? It would be very weird for us if one of our students stopped progressing for any length of time, and we didn't try to find the cause of this problem, because we do see it as a problem, right? If one of our students isn't progressing.
Oh, yeah.
And then we try to solve it, right? But it's not seen as something that we can tolerate at all in a student, right? Because they're here to learn, and we're here to facilitate that, right? And when we're in, if a teacher is going through training like at university, like we did, we're learning just so much stuff every week. And again, not progressing would be seen as an undesirable thing, right? But when when you graduate and your training kind of ends, that it's easy to slip out of the kind of student mindset, right? And get set in your ways. You're comfortable doing things in the same way that you have been for a while. It works. Why do we need to change anything, right? That has a sense of being comfortable. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with becoming comfortable as a teacher, right? But if we stop our self-improvement, right, then we get into a dangerous spot where we begin to stagnate, right? A lot of other professions have built-in requirements that you can never stop learning, right? Like school teachers, they have professional development. They need to take certain amount of continuing education and professional development classes, otherwise they can lose their teaching license. Or like a surgeon, right? They need to stay up to date on medical journals, and they can never stop learning. But we have no regulatory body, and it's just up to ourselves to police ourselves, right? To make sure that we don't get complacent. So, have you noticed any kind of times in your career now that you've graduated? How long have you been graduated for now, Arianne?
Since May, so I guess that would be about 8 months or so, 7, 8
Yeah,
months.
and did you notice a change after you exited university?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it went from being a pressure cooker of having to learn my recital pieces for the master's program to it's almost as though, the rocket ship that was launched into the atmosphere is now in space, and there's no more resistance from the atmosphere, to put it a little metaphorically. That's how I always felt, that, oh, suddenly I'm just floating in space and there's nothing that I need to fight anymore. But as you're saying, stagnation in this profession and in many professions just is not going to help us improve in our jobs and in our craft. So we have got to fight that urge to just be complacent and sit back and relax too much. I totally agree, because I think the students and families and clients, for first of all, can tell when we're out of practice, be it when we're demonstrating certain passages or something like that. And also because as educators and artists, we need to constantly fuel our need to be inspired.
Absolutely. I can totally agree. You know, after I graduated, I found it difficult to self-motivate to continue to study new music and push myself, right? Because there is such a driving pressure, like you're saying, in university to continue to push yourself, you know, past any kinds of limits that you've built up for yourself, right? And then after graduation, all of a sudden, the rhythm of your life just changes, right? You're no longer bound by these 16-week blocks of time in between, you know, spurts of relaxation, right? You're no longer bound by the college schedule. But the personal practice, our own you know, piano study is only one of those areas that we can stagnate in, right? When we're talking about a music studio, it's helpful to think about the entire music studio, right? And part of that is absolutely our teaching itself, right? But that's only part of the whole music studio. We also have the business side of things as well as the technological side of things. And we shouldn't stagnate in any of these areas because, like you were saying, people notice, not only when they notice we're not practicing, but they notice when things aren't changing, right? You know, an example of stagnation would be lapsing in your maintenance of your piano, right? Allowing your piano to go out of tune a little bit too much before taking care of it, right? Or if you don't have the greatest instrument, not working towards upgrading that would be a stagnation, right? That would be a stagnation on the technology side of a music studio, right? So when we're thinking about the future, we always want to have some kind of plan for how we can continue to improve continuously, right? And having that for our teaching, for our technology, and for our business is absolutely crucial, right? So when we are doing this kind of planning, it's easy to just plan for the future, right? To just take out a piece of paper and write, you know, by the end of the year, I want to have all of this done. But for setting realistic goals, right? That part of our job as teachers is setting realistic goals for our students. Because if we set them a goal and they're not able to reach that goal. I know I'm guilty of that. Sometimes in the past, I've set goals for my students, and then I've had to pare back that expectation, and that's never a good thing. Has that ever happened to you?
Yes, it has, especially in the early stages of preparing students for recitals for the very first time as a teacher. You know, for my very first time as a teacher, having to prepare students for recitals and performances and things like that. Oh yeah, you know, you get a better sense of how much a student or a teacher can really handle in a given amount of time, and there's so many different factors. So in the same way, uh, at least we have some advantage as teachers who want to set goals for ourselves, because we have seen what it takes to successfully goal set with our students.
Absolutely. We have a bit of practice with it, right? We have a bit of practice with it. So to help contextualize things, instead of only looking forward, it's also very helpful to look back, right? So if you want to set some long-term goals for yourself, say you want to set some goals for things that you want to accomplish by the end of 2024, right? So that's looking 1 year ahead, right? We'll say January of 2025 is our end date, right? It's also helpful for us to first look back at what was going on in January of 2023 in whatever area we're looking for. Are we looking to push our business forward and try new things, provide new opportunities? Are we looking to hone our teaching our teaching methods, or maybe we're looking to integrate technology in new and different ways that we haven't previously, right? So in order to set a goal for a year in the future, it can help to look at where we were a year in the past, right? So
that's a great point, you know, and that self-reflection, I think, is critical for goal setting.
absolutely, yeah. So I'm thinking in my personal studio, some of the goals that I'm looking to accomplish in 2024, right? Looking back first at where I was at the beginning of 2023, right? At the beginning of 2023, my studio was a little less full. I had just had a major surgery, so things weren't really, I wasn't super busy, and because of that major surgery, I also wasn't really interested at the time in really pushing things forward. So I was basically just coasting for much of 2023. In fact, I was really just trying to get myself back on my feet, and I reestablished my student. No, I mean I went from like 20 up to more like 27, so it wasn't a dramatic number, but that's an important thing to contextualize for myself, right? I did just, its surgery was a little over a year ago, and setting a goal in the future, I shouldn't necessarily expect the world of myself in this next year. So some personal goals for me in 2024 is I'm looking to reintegrate. Looking to reintegrate composition into my studio. It's something that I've previously introduced, but I was not able to give it the kind of focus and attention that it needed for it to be a major part of my studio and my students' experience, right? For example, right now it's on my website, my studio's website, that my students are not only great performers, but they're also great composers. And I don't think that I'm living up to that expectation that I'm putting on people, right? So 2024 is I'm looking to get myself back in that composition mindset, and I've outlined a couple ways for myself to make that happen. In August, I'm going to be introducing a composer's workshop as my first add-on program for my students. Everything right now is all inclusive, so at whatever tuition option, they're getting everything, basically. Just the length of their lesson changes. But in August, I'm going to be updating my program with a composer's workshop as an add-on. I'm not sure about the pricing right now, but it'll be a once a month group class for my students to take, where they can get extra composition projects, share their compositions, and kind of give a way for me to dip my toes into really making that a priority. Also in August, I'm announcing a third recital every year. Right now I do 2 recitals every year, and I'm announcing a third recital. And that recital is only going to be music that is composed by students of my piano studio. So either they're performing their own compositions,
Wow.
or they're going to be performing compositions written by either myself or another student of my piano studio. So I'm setting myself a very lofty, not lofty, but very intentional goal by announcing something like this to my students, to my clients. If I am kind of forcing myself to have a certain degree of follow through on that, because if no one's composing, then when it comes time for that, composition recital, I'm going to be in a bit of a pickle if there's no one that's been composing. And
a good way to keep yourself accountable.
Yeah, right, because it's hard. It's hard to stay, we were just talking about staying motivated. So by announcing certain things to your clients, and even in my announcement, I'm planning to do a bit of a mea culpa and talk about how, I several years ago, I announced this, but I haven't really followed through with it, and it hasn't been a big enough part of my studio. And I'm looking to rectify that going forward.
And I'm sure that, that honesty will be very constructive. Honesty with self, perhaps honesty with the clients. That that should, I don't know, kind of be cleansing. I feel like it just paves the way for, you know, a true new goal to be set, and that's a really cool goal. My thought about it is, you know, is that a personal goal per se, or is it more of a studio goal? And if so, if you agree that it's a little bit more of a studio goal, then my follow-up question would be, do you have any goals that only involve your own growth as a
So I
teacher?
do agree that it's more of a studio goal, right? A lot of this is about growth, continuous improvement as a piano teacher is pretty closely entwined with your studio, which are hard to separate out being a piano teacher if you also own your own studio. But for myself, I absolutely, I have some goals this year. Um, One of the things I do with my students is I set a practice theme for the upcoming year. They set it. So they set one area of practice that they want to try to really focus on for the upcoming year, right? So by the end of 2024, they'll look back at the video they recorded for themselves and be able to honestly say, wow, I'm way better at articulations now in December than I was in January, right? And last year's theme was about trying to rekindle my passion for the piano, because since graduating university, I really struggled to find that passion and find that reason to practice. And I made some headway with that, but this year I'm really going to try to push that forward and find reasons to practice, find music that makes me feel passionate, and do that for myself. Yeah, on a personal level. What about you?
Oh, well, I like that a lot. And I wish you the best of luck with both your studio goals and your personal musical goals, and goals in general. For me, I would like to start working on, you know, going through my jazz fake book and picking out the pieces, the standards that I love, and going through and actually, how do I say, composing my own renditions of each standard that I like. Maybe I'll pick 4 or 5 and then go out and just hash out a written jazz arrangement um, of these, because I
Cool.
was classically trained and I'm having a hard time learning how to just improvise jazz music. So I figure if I could just think through and give myself some kind of stepping stone, then I might be able to improvise more effectively in the future after this stepping stone phase between the bridge phase between being classically trained and being proficient in jazz piano.
That's awesome. That sounds like a really great goal for yourself. And composition, do you compose a lot?
Not really, but I would love to start. I composed a little bit in college, and then, you know, once I entered the workforce, all of that kind of fell by the wayside. But now that I'm out of school, I just want to keep on fueling that creative side of my mind. Still need to work on my studio goals, though.
Do you have those kinds of those goals in mind, or do you find yourself just kind of getting by from day to day with your studio?
For studio goals, I do have one in mind that I've talked to my partner a lot. Um, you know, he asks, when are you going to have a recital of your own? I've never actually held my own recital separate from the community music schools that I worked at in the past years. So in May, we're going to go through that whole process of looking at different recital venues, and by May having one ready for all the students to perform at. So that's my
That's great.
goal.
That's awesome. That's huge. That's a big step forward.
Nerve
And
wracking.
that's awesome. Yeah. So, as in closing for this topic, I also wanted to say that these continuous studio improvements are also a wonderful justification to continue to raising the price of your tuition. Because if you continue to offer more things at a higher quality and have exciting new things to announce, that pairs very well with raised prices. And it's not unfair to do that, because you're offering more and you're bettering yourself, and that's worth something, right? That's worth something. So the announcement in August will be paired with a price increase.
All right. Yeah. All the music teachers out there, take note from what Jacqueline is saying right here. Take note of what she's saying, because you know, we got to be mindful of our moolah. It can't just be charity work, and we have to know our worth.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any last thoughts before we move on to your topic?
Well, once again, I wish you the best of luck in achieving your goals. I know you will, and I'm excited to hear more about how the students' compositions go. That is so exciting.
Absolutely. So scales. I remember I was talking with my partner, and I mentioned that your topic was scales, and I said that is just a fascinating topic. And I was thinking, to someone not in the know, that might come off as being very sarcastic, right? Oh, scales, what an interesting topic. But it really is such a wide open, just there's so many different ways of teaching scales, and it is really fascinating to me. So I'd love to hear what you have to talk about.
Oh my gosh, I think that is hilarious that occurred to you. That it never even occurred to me in this conversation until you brought it up, that could be misconstrued as a sarcastic thing. Because to me, I am just floored to talk about scales. There's so many possibilities when teaching scales. You don't have to necessarily use a book, which is ideal for all those students who struggle to just keep their eyes on a page or something like that. And for your visual learners, you absolutely can teach scales using a book or pamphlets. There are just so many ways to do it, and you can really tailor the teaching of scales to each individual student if you really want to. And I appreciate that flexibility, because I strive to tune in to each student's needs. And that can mean teaching scales completely differently from one person to the next who walks into the studio. So let's get to it. First off, once the student, say they're a beginner or an elementary student, once they have the necessary finger strength to play and dexterity to play each key individually, one after the other, then a 5-finger pattern, a 5-finger scale is pretty straightforward and easy to teach. What I like to also do is teach contrary motion, at the beginner level, with the right hand playing C 5-finger scale up and down, while the left hand plays backwards starting from middle C at the same time, in what I like to term a butterfly position for the younger learners. And
do you do that from the earliest stages? When do you take it from hands alone to hands together?
pretty early on, definitely not in the first session or two, but once I've determined that the student is able to use their fingers independently in the hand. So it really depends on the person. But if they're more comfortable with playing things like melodic fifths at first, in the Faber books, for instance, or just playing steps, then we hold off on 5-finger scales until a little bit later. But some students, especially the ones who play sports in their childhood, they have that dexterity and finger strength and form kind of built in right off the bat. So again, case to case, it's different. I've waited months for some and waited just a week or two for others. even though they're at the same repertoire level, you know.
Gotcha.
After contrary motion, which is a great way for one hand to teach the other, for the dominant hand to teach the non-dominant hand, for instance, how to do that pattern. We move on to parallel motion. And I know a lot of teachers don't like to do this, but I just tell my students, even if they're tiny, no matter how old they are, I tell them, I use the words contrary motion, the terms contrary and parallel motion to describe what's happening. Once they understand the concept of contrary motion versus parallel motion, no matter how little they are or how big they are, it just paves the way for learning octave scales. So is that something that you like to do? I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Do you use these terms when describing the different directions that your hands can go relative to each other?
I think it's a really interesting question because it's not only related to just contrary and parallel motion, right? So many things that we can name don't necessarily need a name when they're first introduced, right? For example, I don't name the concept of dynamics. Forte and piano exist in a vacuum before the concept of dynamics is introduced, right? As well as for contrary and parallel motion, I don't name those because I've never really, but when we introduced the 5-finger scales, the concept of parallel and contrary, they would exist in just the scales, just the scale practice. There would not be in the book I use, in the books that I use, contrary and parallel motion isn't in their sheet music at that stage. So yeah. I would struggle to keep it relevant and for them to make a connection to something when there is no, oblique is really it's only used a couple of times. And so the short answer is no, because there isn't an opportunity for them to use that knowledge in their sheet music.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. It could be hard to put a more abstract concept like that into practice without repertoire examples. But I don't know. I was pretty surprised to find that even my youngest students seem to get it after a while of just doing the gesture in the air for them and performing the gesture in the air for them. And I'm really big on scales, so I guess one of my studio goals is to introduce supplemental repertoire to the elementary level students that contains scale work done in both hands simultaneously, because usually, you might have scale work in one hand or the other, but it's just like a right hand, left hand coordination job that can actually be more easily taught than one might imagine once you really practice it, maybe with a steady beat, metronome, things like that. Give little pointers like, oh, the second finger and fourth finger usually coincide. Same with the third, same with 4 and 2, and then same with 1 and 5. These are all little tricks. Once you get into the octave scales, I usually like to ask the student, are you more of a letters person or a numbers person, or both? And depending on the way they respond, I'll just quickly write out a little chart for them, C, D, E, cross under, F, G, da, da, da. And, or 1, 2, 3, cross under, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and back. And I also have these flashcards that group the 3 white key groups together, and then other flashcards that have the 4 white key group, F, G, A, B. So if you block that across the entire keyboard, anyone can do that and
for sure
learn the C scale at the multi-octave level.
Yeah, I'm gonna go grab something right over here from my piano that's actually quite relevant to this topic, um, because what you were just talking about with the groups is very similar to an approach that I was taught in university that I use with when I get to the octave scales. For those of you who are listening on just the audio, you won't be able to see this, but for those of you watching the video, you can see that I'm holding up a chart here with the right hand C major fingering written out, and below that the left hand C major fingering written out. And the fingering is split up into 3 different groups: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 as a separate
Nice.
group. And I use a similar approach to what you're describing about grouping them.
Yeah, it's a pretty effective approach, just because blocking things tends to really be repetitive, and you can apply it to any register of the keyboard, and it really reinforces the student's idea of when they need to cross under or over, and when they use pinky. You can do it in any direction, etc. Um, but I find for the more auditory learners, it tends to, reciting things and kind of exclaiming the word cross, like right between the 2 notes where you cross, seems to work pretty well. Or for multi-octave scales, let's say you're working with someone who's now ready to do a 2-octave scale, um, saying things like 3, 4, 3 at the moment at which you cross tends to help a lot. Introducing the rule of 3-4-3 helps, and then incorporating that, so in the moment while they're doing it, reciting for them, in my experience, almost never fails.
Yeah, we don't have time to fully cover the issue. I mean, we could spend weeks just discussing scales, but we may bore some of our listeners. But I was curious about the technique that how you teach the technique for the octave scales. How do you teach that technique for the cross under or crossover?
Oh yeah, so once the person learns, you're saying, sorry, multi-octave, you said?
No, just for the single octave, the cross under with the thumb, or crossover with 3
I
or 4.
usually I usually have the student, I demonstrate, I model first, and I emphasize the importance of wrist alignment, making sure that the wrist usually stays aligned with the biggest knuckle and the elbow, making sure that any wrist movement and overall arm movement remains from side to side rather than kind of bobbing up and down, which is such a ubiquitous rookie mistake when you're first learning that technique of crossing under for the octave scale. And those once we've discussed that more gesture oriented technique, then I get into the reciting for auditory students and the charting out very similarly to how you did it, with grouping numbers like 1, 2, 3 and 1, 2, 3, 4, and then saying only your highest pitch in the right hand gets the 5th finger, or only your lowest pitch in the left hand gets the 5th finger in most of these white key scales.
And do you ask them, would you be able to ask your students which note gets finger number 5? Would that be something that they would be able to internalize and then respond with?
I think once they've practiced the scale a few times, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Last week we talked about preparation stage learning. Are scales something that you work ahead of time to prepare for, or is this a thing that you introduce all at once?
Well, I'm kind of disappointed. I think Faber really dropped the ball on this. The Piano Adventures introduces octave scales so late in the game, compared to when they could. I feel like that I do a lot of preparation stage learning, um, with as far as scales go. My students know their octave scales almost as pretty much as soon as they get to the lesson book one in Faber, if not sooner. And a lot of times it's because they've heard scales before, maybe from a sibling that I teach, or maybe from my demonstration, and they're eager to learn.
It's interesting, yeah. The Faber does introduce them. It's one of the big some people have a big criticism about that, and also some people have a big criticism about eighth notes being introduced far too late in their opinions.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because I think that I have a much lower focus, much smaller focus on scales with my students than I otherwise could. I find that some students, maybe this is not to say some students, that I find it tricky to make them relevant for the very early elementary student. I do 5-finger scales. I usually do C and G are scales I cover while a student is in the primer level book, and then I start going through the circle of fifths for the 5-finger scales during the level 1 book. But I typically don't cover the full octave scales until well, I mean, I use preparation stage learning, but I don't really cover them until they'll start seeing it in their music.
Yeah, it's tricky to know when to introduce scales and why. It's sometimes difficult to explain to students in this day and age why scales, arpeggios, cadences, chords are so important. But I I rewatched Aristocats for the first time ever in my adult life, yet just yesterday, and for me it just goes back to that song. Um, you must learn your scales and your arpeggios. Like when I was growing up, I didn't even question it, and I find that it learning scales does have some kind of grounding effect on students who are otherwise all over the place in their learning. Jumping
Yeah.
from topic to topic, maybe if they're struggling with the subject matter. I choose scales, chords, and cadences, and finger patterns, etudes as a grounding mechanism for them.
Yeah, and that sounds like a really good way to keep your students, with anchored with some consistency for sure. Yeah, and so you introduce the octave scale. Do you introduce music that gives them the sheet music representation, or rather, music that uses the octave scales in it before it's introduced in 2B, in the Faber 2B?
Yeah. There are a few pieces in the Masterwork Classic series or Keith Snell. All of these repertoire books that contain Baroque, classical, romantic, and 20th century works tend to have more of an emphasis on scales, as well as some significant pedagogical works from more recent times. So I like to incorporate those a lot. The works of Florence Price usually incorporate a lot of scale work too. So I'm happy to lean on that.
Gotcha. Well, it's just about time for us to wrap up. Do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I don't know if it's too late to say this, but my Christmas lights are still up, and I just wanted to wish everyone a happy new year.
My decorations are also still up, and yes, I do wish everybody a happy new year and hope that their holiday season went well. But I think that's it for us today. Thanks for listening to the Piano Pedagogy podcast, and we will see you next week.